Good morning. We are at the very end of 1 Kings, chapter 22 to be exact. We talked last week toward the end of class about Naboth's vineyard. Ahab, sometimes you just go blank. Ahab, the king, wanted Naboth's vineyard, offered to buy it, and Naboth, of course, says, well, I can't do that. It needs, according to the law, it needs to stay in my family. Ahab pouts about it. Of course, Jezebel comes along. Hey, you're the king. Stop pouting. I'll get you that vineyard. And we talked about Jezebel just being Jezebel. She was a wicked, wicked woman. And so she decides to get false witnesses to say that they heard Naboth commit blasphemy. And so if you have 2 or 3 witnesses, you can carry out the punishment for that, which it was, again, we mentioned this, capital crime. So poor old Naboth dies, all because of Jezebel's scheming. And of course, yes, ma'am. Right. Yeah, that is an interesting question. The question was, would his, maybe because he was executed for blasphemy, would that keep his family from receiving that inheritance? Because that was his original concern anyways, why he wouldn't sell it to Ahab. I don't know the answer to that either. Offhand, I'd have to do some more study in the law of Moses as far as looking at that. That's an interesting question. Yeah, you would think it. And there may be more to that story that we're just not told by inspiration. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that right offhand. That would be an interesting study to check out and see. So, of course, Elijah comes with a message for Ahab and says, God knows. We've pointed this out numerous times. Well, we can fool humans, but you never fool God. And the message for Ahab is, God knows exactly what you and Jezebel have done here. Poor old Naboth, people think he committed blasphemy. They've carried out this capital punishment. And you think you just can go down there and take his vineyard. In fact, you remember Elijah met Ahab in the vineyard and says, you're gonna suffer for this. You're gonna be punished by God. Of course, so is Jezebel. And we pointed out, the text points out how Jezebel stirred up Ahab. He was not by any means a righteous person, a good person who's going to try to follow God. But boy, she stirred him up. She was a super evil person. And so the sentence comes down, what's going to happen with them. Ahab actually humbles himself. Again, you see the long-suffering of God. You see the mercy of God, the love of God. And God says, well, Ahab humbled himself before me. I'm not, and that's the last verse, I'm not going to bring this calamity during his days, but in his son's days will I bring this, the evil upon his house. So, get into chapter 22. And now you have, I was trying to pull up something here. I like keeping another version open in case I want to compare, and sometime during the week I switched back to King James, so I got to switch over to New King James here. So in chapter 22, there's this is going to be Ahab's encounter with Micaiah. We've discussed this before. I don't know if we've ever studied it in depth, but they form an alliance. Ahab and Jehoshaphat. Now, who's Jehoshaphat? He's king over Judah. And they're going to go to war against Syria. And that's where Syria comes into play. 3 years without war, but in the third year, Jehoshaphat comes down, and king of Israel says, hey, Ramoth Gilead, or Ramoth in Gilead, is ours, and we're just sitting here. That's what he's basically saying. We're just sitting here not taking it. I mean, it's right there. It's ripe for the picking. So he says to Jehoshaphat in verse 4, are you going to go with me to the battle? Jehoshaphat says, and we talked about, I've mentioned it before. I feel like I've mentioned it several times, but it's just, sometimes you hear a sermon that sticks in your mind, and sometimes you read an article or something that sticks in your mind. But I remember an article, this would have been like 04, 05, but Reagan's dad wrote it, and the title of the article was, "What Are You Doing, Jehoshaphat?" and he goes through several instances in the life of King Jehoshaphat where here's a king that by and large was a faithful king. He followed God for the most part. He tended to seek God. But then there were just these moments, and of course we all have those moments, but there were some pretty major moments in his life that you just shake your head when you read the text and you go, Jehoshaphat, what are you doing? And this is one of them. Because he says to Ahab, I am as you are. My people is your people. My horses, your horses. Everything I've got as far as my military might, I consider it yours. Let's go. We're going to form this alliance. So they do. And Jehoshaphat says, he does have the sense, spiritual sense, to say, why don't you inquire at the word of the Lord? And so the king of Israel gathers the prophets together. These are false prophets, obviously, and we've used the term before, yes men. About 400 men, verse 6. And so he asks them, shall I go to Ramoth Gilead and go to battle? And they say, yeah, go. God's going to deliver it into the hand of the king. Well, guess what Ahab wanted to hear? He wanted to hear somebody say, yeah, go. And they know what he wants to hear. And so they say, they're not dumb. The king wants to go to battle. He wants to go fight this battle. So sure, tell him. If he gets killed in the battle, what's going to happen to us? Nothing, he'll be dead. These are just yes men. They're telling him exactly what he wants to hear. Jehoshaphat is a little more perceptive here. And I don't know if he perceives that these are just the yes men of the king, or if this is more to do with he knows they're false prophets, or maybe it's a little bit of both. I don't know. But he says, is there not a prophet of Jehovah that we might inquire of him? Verse 7. And you know what Ahab says? Well, there's one. Yeah, there is that one guy, Micaiah. But what does he say about Micaiah? I hate him. When I was growing up, sometimes kids would get mad at a friend or something. I hate her. I hate him. My mom or my grandmother, I heard it from several different people, and I've said it before even to my children. Sometimes you'll say, hate it's a strong word. And you be careful throwing that around. I tell children that. I heard that growing up. It's a strong word, but buddy, Ahab, he knows it's a strong word, and he intends it to be strong. He says, I hate that guy because he doesn't ever prophesy anything good concerning me. Well, imagine that, Ahab. Maybe you ought to change your ways, buddy. And Jehoshaphat says, again, here's Jehoshaphat. He's just, like I said, you sometimes say, what are you doing? And he's an enigma to me a lot of times when I'm studying this section of Scripture, because that's the phrase that keeps coming to mind. Jehoshaphat, what are you doing? But here he's just kind of, don't be that way, Ahab. Let's call him. So the king of Israel calls an officer and says, bring me Micaiah. And they continue this asking different prophets, and I'm using that term loosely, false prophets, of course. And these kings are sitting on their thrones, and they're in their robes at the entrance of the gate of Samaria there in verse 10. And you got this guy Zedekiah, and he comes, he makes horns of iron. And he says, with these horns of iron, you're going to push the Syrians until you've consumed them. So he takes it a step further. He doesn't just say go to war. He actually makes him an illustration, an object lesson. Horns of iron, iron being strong, this is to represent strength. And you got to push them with horns of iron. You're going to whoop them. And all the prophets prophesied so. Go up to Ramoth Gilead and prosper, for the Lord shall deliver it into the king's hand. So this messenger goes and gets Micaiah, and he says to him in verse 13, hey, the words of the prophets declare good unto the king with one mouth. Everybody's on the same page here, Micaiah. Let thy word, I pray thee, be like the word of one of them, and speak that which is good. Could you please, for once, just come and play nice, Micaiah, and not go and say anything about how wicked Ahab is or how he's going to fall or whatever? We don't really want to hear that. Could you just go? Everybody else is saying the king wants to go to battle. Everybody's saying that. He's going to go to battle anyways. Just go in there and say, go to battle, king. That's all you got to do, Micaiah. And you know what Micaiah's response is? Verse 14. As the Lord liveth, what the Lord saith unto me, that will I speak. I don't care about your alliances. I don't care about if everybody's on the same page. It's not that Micaiah just wanted to be difficult, contrary. He says, I'm going to say what God says. What a lesson is in that. He's not going to be pressured by peer pressure. He's not going to be pressured by the king. He's not going to be pressured just to go along and get along. He says, I'm going to say what God tells me to say. So he came to the king. And the king asked him, you can almost picture Ahab here, and he knows where this thing is going, probably. Okay, Micaiah, we've called you here. Do we go to Ramoth Gilead or not? And you can almost see him look over to Jehoshaphat and go, watch this. Here it comes. And of course, what does Micaiah answer? This is what we call, at the end of verse 15, what's the literary term for this? I need my oldest in here. He's been studying literature in his this semester, and he's actually just been studying this. Sarcasm. And sarcasm really by definition is you say one thing but you mean something else. It's kind of like sometimes I would get in trouble with my mom and you'd be grounded. And I remember one time in particular, we had planned a trip with a bunch of friends to go to Six Flags for spring break. One day of spring break we're going to go to Six Flags, and it's ironic because now I try to avoid that place most of the time, but we were so excited about that. We had this trip planned, a bunch of friends, and it's just going to be so much fun. And I got in trouble. I did something, and I got grounded. And so the day before, I went to Mom, and I said, this was the time I mentioned before, I did a lot of chores, voluntary chores. I mean, I worked hard. And I went to her, and I was telling her about how I did all that. And I said, so, can I go to Six Flags Thursday? And she said, oh, yeah, you can go to Six Flags. But you know what she meant? You're dreaming, buddy. You're not going to get out of it that easily. So sometimes we use sarcasm ourselves, don't we? And that's what happens here with Micaiah. He's not telling him, this is God's word. You go, and everything's going to go great. Because he says, go and prosper. He knows this is what the king wants to hear. And so he's saying, oh, yeah, king, go, prosper. Isn't that what everybody else is saying? Isn't that what they all told me to say? Sure, go, prosper. God's going to deliver it right into your hand, king. That's what you want to hear. And does Ahab get it? Does he figure out that this is sarcasm? If there ever was any doubt that this was sarcasm, Ahab's response confirms it. Because he turns to Micaiah. And he says, how many times shall I adjure thee that thou tell me nothing but that which is true in the name of the Lord? He knows this is not God's will, and yet he's still bent on doing it. And then Micaiah responds, and he gives what we might call kind of like a little parable illustration, however you want to word that. Saw all Israel scattered upon the hills as sheep, not having a shepherd. The Lord said, these have no master. Let them return, every man to his house in peace. The sheep, the people, the citizens. Let them return home in peace. And the king of Israel, now he turns to Jehoshaphat and he says, didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you this guy was going to come and say nothing but bad about me? And then Micaiah has more to say. Hear thou, therefore, the word of the Lord. And he talks about the Lord sitting on his throne and said, who's going to persuade Ahab that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And I don't know that this actually happened. This seems to be some kind of an illustration. But he says, there are these different ones that are answering, one in this manner, another on that manner. Verse 20. And there came forth a spirit and stood before the Lord and said, I'll persuade him. How? Came the question. He said, I will go forth and will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. He says, thou shalt persuade him and prevail also. Go forth and do so. Sometimes people key in on this, skeptics and such, and they say, look here, God's sending somebody just to lie and to deceive Ahab. And how does God get mad at people for lying and deceiving when he sends somebody? Again, God is not telling this spirit to go and lie. And again, I think you have to keep this in the context and realize this is an illustration. This is a vision Micaiah had. And I don't even know that he's describing an actual vision that he had as much as it's an illustration to point out to Ahab, you're going to fall at Ramoth Gilead. God has decreed it. And here's how you're letting it happen. You're letting people come and just lie to you. And you're taking the bait, hook, line, and sinker. And you're going to go and you're going to fall at Ramoth Gilead. I don't think this is really anything I don't think he's describing an actual scene that happened in heaven that it just so happened Micaiah was privy to watching. This is an illustration pointing out God has decreed you're going to fall at Ramoth Gilead one way or the other. Turns out you're going to fall because you're going to listen to a bunch of liars. So, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these thy prophets, he says, verse 23. And again, remember in Scripture, sometimes something is attributed to God that God allowed to happen. People key in on these phrases without taking the overall context into account. And I mean the overall context of the Bible, Old Testament, and specifically here. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of sarcasm from Micaiah here. And not being rude or ugly, but there's a background here that inspiration doesn't give us. But Micaiah and Ahab have had their moments, obviously. I mean, just Ahab's statement, I hate that guy. He never says anything good about me. Really, any faithful prophet of Jehovah has had his moments with Ahab, it seems like at this point. Elijah, now Micaiah. And maybe that with Micaiah, he's just, kind of done with Ahab, and he's being sarcastic here, but he's trying to make the point. God has decreed, as Jimmy pointed out there at the end of verse 33, God's decreed, King James has evil. It doesn't mean moral evil. It means calamity. What did you say you had there? Disaster? Disaster. God's decreed disaster against you. This is a judgment against Ahab because of his wickedness. And you're going to let it happen because you're listening to lying prophets. But Zedekiah goes over and he just smacks Micaiah. Smote him on the cheek. Says, hey man, which way went the Spirit of the Lord for me to speak unto thee? He's mocking Micaiah. He says, you'll see. You'll see in that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide thyself. And so the king of Israel, he's done with this. He says, just take him. Take him back to Ammon, the governor of the city, to Joash, the king's son. And not only that, he says, put him in the prison, feed him with the bread of affliction and the water of affliction. It almost sounds like he's ordering them to torture him, or at least, at the very least, not to be nice at all. He says, you do that until I come back home in peace. Micaiah says, buddy, if you come home in peace, I'm not a prophet of Jehovah. That ain't happening, Ahab. You ain't coming home in peace. And he said, hearken, O people, every one of you. You can almost see I picture almost a scene like you'd see in a movie where they're dragging him out, kicking and screaming, so to speak. And he says, listen up, everybody. I told you, as they're dragging him out, he says, you better listen. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, they go out to the battle. They go to Ramoth-Gilead. Ahab says, I'm going to disguise myself. But you put on your robes. I've often wondered about that. And I'm sitting here thinking, Jehoshaphat, you dummy. I mean, they see a king in battle. That's the guy they want, right? And Ahab said, I'll disguise myself, but you go ahead and put on your robes. I'm sure it'll be fine. If I'm Jehoshaphat, I'm saying, no, I'm going to disguise myself too. The king of Syria, he tells his 32 captains, you don't fight with anybody except the king of Israel, verse 31. So when they see the captains of the chariots, they see Jehoshaphat, and there's the king of Israel, and guess what they do? They're coming after him. But Jehoshaphat, he cries out, and I don't know if that's what gave it away. Maybe he cries out, I'm not him. I don't know. Maybe of course, I guess he wouldn't have known that they were just going after the king of Israel. But whatever, he cries out, and they figure out this is not Ahab. And so they turn back from pursuing him. And this is a lot of coincidence, isn't it? But it's not coincidence, is it? And there's more coincidence, and I'm using that term in quotes because it's not coincidence. It's providence and some even perhaps miraculous here going on because God has decreed Ahab's going to fall in this battle. So they turn away from chasing Jehoshaphat. And so a certain man draws a bow at a venture. Maybe he's just an archer and he's just kind of, it looks like there's a lot going on. I'm just going to throw an arrow in there and see if I can hit somebody. Maybe he's drawing back and, maybe he's been waiting for the fire command and his grip weakens or something and he lets go. I don't know. I know God's hand is in this because he draws a bow at a venture and he hits somebody. He hits King Ahab, who's wearing armor, but it didn't just hit him in the armor and bounce off like you might have expected. It goes between the joints of the harness. Coincidence? No, it's not coincidence. So he tells his chariot driver, carry me away, I'm wounded. So the battle increased that day. The king was stayed up in his chariot against the Syrians. He died at evening, we would say, and the blood ran out of the wound into the midst of the chariot. There went a proclamation throughout the host about the going down of the sun, saying, every man to his city, every man to his country, to his own country. Remember the sheep that were scattered and they were allowed to go back home? So the king died and he was brought to Samaria. They buried him there. They washed the chariot in the pool of Samaria. The dogs licked up his blood. They washed his armor according to the word of the Lord, which he spake. Elijah had told him this. So the rest of the acts of Ahab are written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Ahab slept with his fathers. Ahaziah reigns in his stead. And then beginning at verses 41 through 50, you have the reign of Jehoshaphat in Judah. The narrative switches. And again, you see this in Kings and Chronicles, but especially in Kings. The narrative will switch. Northern kingdom, southern kingdom. Well, here it switches back to the southern kingdom. Jehoshaphat was a good king for the most part. Again, there are times when you just wonder what is he thinking. He's going to follow God faithfully for the most part. He walked in the ways of Asa his father, verse 43. The high places, though, were not taken away. The people offered and burned incense yet in the high places. Well, that's the people. The common people sometimes are caught up in idolatry, even when the king, you'll see this in other instances as well. A king will turn to God with all his heart, but sometimes the common people continue to offer and burn incense in those high places, worshiping idols. Jehoshaphat, though, he made peace with the king of Israel, and he's kind of, again, he's going back to Jehoshaphat, but we've recapped most of that. The rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat are written in the Chronicles, the book of the Chronicles, the kings of Judah. The remnant of the Sodomites, which remained in the days of his father Asa, he took out of the land. There was no king in Edom. There was a deputy king. So then you have this instance in verse 49. It's about verses, I think it's just 48 here, isn't it? Yeah, Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they went not, for the ships were broken at Ezion Geber. That's really all you get here. If you want more detail on that, and I'm just going to hold off till we come to Chronicles, but it's in 2 Chronicles 20, 36 and 37. It tells us why those ships were broken. And the short version of that is they were broken because of his alliance with Ahaziah, the idolatrous king in the north. So idolatry is still a problem. Some kings try to eradicate idolatry, and some kings do a better job than others. But idolatry remains a problem with these people. No righteous kings in the north. We've talked about that. But even in the south, you have kings that try to get the nation to turn back to God, and the majority of them may, but a lot of times you see these statements about idolatry remaining in the land, and it's going to continue to be a problem until when? What solves the idolatry problem? The captivity. And that's one of the things God says leading up to the captivity is, I'm going to break you from this idolatry once and for all. But Israel, they had problems after the captivity, but idolatry was not one of them. And then verses 51 through 53 here, you have the reign of Ahaziah, an exceedingly wicked king in the north. Again, the narrative shifts to Ahaziah in the north. And that's the end of what we call 1 Kings, but kind of try to erase that from your mind, because the historical account just continues right on. So sometimes when we're teaching this, and if I'm ever asked to teach, if somebody says, could you teach 1 Kings, that just makes me cringe. Because I'm like, how do you teach 1 Kings and just stop there? That's not the whole story. Unless you're going to go pick up right after that and go into 2 Kings. So that's what we're going to do, of course. This 2 Kings is just a continuation. It's the continued decline and fall of the two kingdoms. You'll see the fall of the northern kingdom, and then you'll see a little bit later the fall of the southern kingdom. This is going to continue the history of the monarchy, which began in 1 Samuel. 2 Kings will cover about 250 years, from the death of Ahab to the beginning of the Babylonian captivity. And really, I've got beginning in my notes. Let's just jump over to the very end of 2 Kings. I think it covers to the end. It sums it up in just a verse or two. But I typed that in my notes, and then I'm just sitting here thinking, well, it doesn't. It just says that in the 37th year of captivity of Jehoiakim, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, began to reign, and in the year that he began to reign, he lifted up the head of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, out of prison. And he spake kindly to him and set his throne above the throne of the kings that were with him in Babylon. So I guess you can't really say to the end of the captivity, but at least into the captivity. Who is Ahaziah, by the way? When we open up 2 Kings, well, if you go back just a page, look at verse 51 of 1 Kings 22. This is Ahab's son. So remember, in the north, you have several different dynasties. Sometimes a king reigns and his son takes over after him. Many times that's not the case. Ahaziah, by the way, will be the end of Ahab's dynasty. And it's going to change again. I want to say, and I can't keep forgetting to check this, I wanted to get the actual numbers. I want to say, for some reason, the number 9 sticks out in my mind, and I don't know if that's right, so don't quote me on that. But I think there are something like 9 different dynasties, families, that end up on the throne in Israel. In Judah, it's just one. It's David's dynasty, right? So, getting into chapter 1 here, you have Elijah. He's going to denounce Ahaziah. Moab rebels after the death of Ahab. Ahaziah, he falls through a lattice in his upper chamber there in Samaria. That's the capital. That's where his palace would have been. So he fell and he was sick, and he sends messengers. Where does he send his messengers? Not to Elijah. Look at verse 2. Beelzebub. He sends him to inquire of an idol. Am I going to get better? Am I going to recover from this? He asks, shall I recover from this disease? It seems probably he fell. Maybe he cut himself or something in the fall, and there must be some kind of infection setting in. What's the word? Is it going septic? Something like that. So that's probably what's happening here, would be my guess, because he's deathly ill. And he sends people to inquire of an idol. He knows better than this. So the angel of the Lord sends Elijah. And so Elijah, he actually is inquiring of an idol, but Elijah meets him, or at least his messengers. And God says, you go meet the messengers and tell them, is it not because there's not a God in Israel that you go to inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? There's just no God in Israel, huh? You just decided to go ask stones, sticks. Now, therefore, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And Elijah departed. So the messengers come back, and he says, hey, what are you doing? Why you come back so soon? They said, well, we were going, and a man met us, and here's what he had to say. He says, you're going to die. The king says, what did he look like? Verse 7. I'm paraphrasing, of course. What did he look like? I said, well, he was a hairy man, girt with a girdle of leather about his loins, and he says, I know who that was. That was that rascal Elijah. He knew exactly who it was. And he probably knew pretty much, like we would say 95% sure before he even asked that question. But he kind of wants to confirm it. Hey, what did he look like? Well, he's a hairy man, girded about with leather. Knew it. That's Elijah. So he says, you take 50 men and the captain, you bring him to me. I'm going to deal with him. So they go and they say, the king hath said, come down. There's some cockiness here, isn't there? There's some disrespect for Elijah as a prophet of God. And Elijah says, if I'm a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume thee and thy 50. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. So old Ahaziah, he says, well, send another captain, and you bring him to me. I'm going to deal with him. So here comes the third captain. Same thing happens. Fire comes down from heaven. So then he sends another one. This fellow, he falls on his knees, and he begs him. And he says, please, verse 13, let my life and the life of these 50 thy servants be precious in thy sight. There came down fire from heaven, burned up the two captains of the former 50s. But let my life be precious in your sight. And so the angel of the Lord says to Elijah, go. You can go with him, and don't be afraid. So God's hand is in this. This is not Elijah just being vindictive. God is teaching Ahaziah a lesson, and some of these soldiers of his as well. Thus saith the Lord, for as much as thou hast sent messengers to inquire of Beelzebub, this is when he comes to the king, by the way, verse 16. Is it not because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? You're not going to come down off that bed. Look, the message hasn't changed, Ahaziah. You can send for me. You can try to bring me here under some kind of arrest. It's not going to change the message. You are idolatrous, you're wicked, and you're going to suffer for it. So he died, according to the word of the Lord, which Elijah had spoken. Jehoram reigned in his stead in the second year of Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, because he had no son. So there's the end of that dynasty. By the way, there's two Jehorams here. Don't get confused. One is in the south, one is in the north. Now the rest of the acts of Ahaziah, they're written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Chapter 2, I'll just give you kind of a summary here, and we may, I think we've studied this before, so I wanted to get through 3 chapters today. Basically, verses 1 through 14, Elijah is taken up into heaven, this chariot of fire. Elijah's one of 2 people never to see death, rather. Who was the other one? Enoch in Genesis 5. Elijah kind of tests Elisha. He's sort of issuing a test. You stay here. And Elisha says, I'm not going to be separated from you. I'm going with you. So it seems like a sort of a test. They get to the river. Elijah takes his mantle or his cloak, smote the river. They cross on dry ground. Ask me for what you will, Elisha. What does he say? What does he ask for? End of verse 9. A double portion of Elijah's spirit. I don't know if it's significant or not, but we have about twice as many miracles recorded from Elisha as we do Elijah. I don't know if that's significant or not. Sometimes I think we can read too much into stuff, but that's kind of interesting because he says, well, you just wait and see, and you'll know you'll know if this is going to happen or not. You've asked a hard thing, verse 10. If you see me when I'm taken up from thee, it shall be so unto thee, but if not, it shall not be so. Well, guess what? He saw him, right? And so, he received that double portion. So they go on and they're talking, and this chariot of fire, horses of fire, parted them both asunder. Elijah went up by whirlwind into heaven. One fellow asked the question, how do you survive the trip to heaven without dying? He didn't die. The Lord took care of that. We don't know how. Some things we're just not told. Was it a literal chariot of fire? It's kind of like what we've been talking about with Revelation on Wednesday nights. It's not a literal chariot of fire, right? But God took care of that. So he carries Elijah up into heaven. These 50 prophets, they suggest in verses 14 through really the next several verses, they suggest going to look for him. So Elisha succeeds Elijah here, verses 15 through really to the end of the chapter, verse 25. They suggest to go look for him. Elisha says, no, don't go look for him. He knows what's happened. He's gone. He's gone up into heaven. Well, they search anyway for 3 days. Did they find him? Of course not. Then you get to verse, I think I got a typo here. Of course, he tells him in verse 18, did I not say to you, go not? I told you weren't going to find him. Verse 19 is kind of another little section here. The men of the city, the situation of this city is pleasant, as my Lord saith, but the water is not, and the ground barren. So he says, bring me a new cruse, put salt therein. They brought it to him, and he goes to the waters, and he casts the salt in there, and he says, thus saith the Lord, I have healed these waters. There shall not be from thence any more death or barren land. So the waters were healed unto this day, unto the day of the writing, of course. So Elisha performs a miracle there in healing the water. The salt didn't do it. This was a miraculous healing of the water. Something was wrong with the water, but now that's been fixed. So he goes up to Bethel, and these little children, the King James has. That's a pretty flexible term in Hebrew. These would have been older children. They were at least old enough to understand what they're doing. They mock him. Go up, thou bald head. They're mocking Elijah. They're mocking Elisha. And Elisha looked on them. He cursed them in the name of the Lord. This is not swearing and cursing. He pronounces a curse in the name of the Lord. This is by the Lord's authority. God's teaching them a lesson. There came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood and tear 42 children of them. Again, these are not little bitty, oh, bless their heart, little innocent children. They didn't know what they were doing. These would have been old enough to be accountable children. And so he returns from there, and then Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 3 next week. And chapter 3, we'll open up here with more about Jehoram, the son of Ahab, reigning over Israel and Samaria. So we'll pick up there, Lord willing. Yes, next Sunday, the 17th, right? Yeah. Thank you very much. We'll have a break before worship.